Afternoon. This is Carmelo Leon. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce you to this event. This event is going to be concerned with the current capacity of the Canary Islands as a tourist destination. I would like to start first by thanking the Canary Islands government and its Ministry of Tourism and Employment, and to FIDE Caja Canarias for the support to carry out this online event, and to the Foundation for the Advancement of System-Oriented Management Theory of St. Gallen in Switzerland for partially funding the study presented here. A special thanks also to all the scholars and stakeholders who have collaborated with the study and the event. And I would like to thank you all for your time, and I hope this is going to be productive and satisfactory for you. The question addressed in this event is going to be the current capacity of the Canary Islands, both in terms of population and the population of tourists. This question has been studied by a team of researchers led by the Sustainability Laboratory of New York, which is directed by Dr. Michael Benelli, and in collaboration with the University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria from the Institute of Tourism and Sustainable Economic Development, TIDES. The Canary Islands, as you all know, has evolved over time with a development process based on the expansion of the tourism sector, receiving in a year more than 15 million tourists and more than 100 million overnight stays, for a population of over 2 million people in 7,500 square kilometers. Currently, some sectors of society have raised the need for a public debate about what should be the expansion of the tourism industry and what will be the population that is manageable within the limits of nature. The reflection on these questions about the Canary Islands can be helpful for other destinations that are also focusing on tourism development around the world. The team for this study has elaborated a model that addresses the questions of the carrying capacity from a systemic point of view. This means that the carrying capacity is conceived as the result of an interplay of a multitude of elements that play a role in a dynamic and interconnected system that involves elements from both natural ecosystems and human systems. The model is outlined in a report that will be distributed to you online after this event. In this event, the research team will present the basic ideas of the model as well as the results, and will discuss with you what are the implications of the concept of the carrying capacity for planning for the future of the Canary Islands. First to speak will be Dr. Michael Benelli, founder and leader of the Sustainability Laboratory, who is a leading expert and pioneer on system thinking and cybernetics applied to social sciences, and who has been awarded the International Green Industry Hall of Fame for life achievement, who is going to give us the project background. And then the speaker will be Dr. Andrea Bassi, who is affiliated with the University of Geneva, Switzerland, and CEO of Knowledge, endowing a PhD in system dynamics and great experience working with the government and international organizations in model development. Finally, the research team will be joined by Professor Raúl Hernández, who is a leading expert in tourism and professor of tourism economics at the University of La Laguna in the Canary Islands, and director of the Chair of Tourism as Hotel, also organizing this event. So first, please, Dr. Michael Benelli, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmelo. Hello, everyone on the call. I think what I'd like to do is give you a little bit about the context of this study and something perhaps about the lab. The Sustainability Laboratory is a not-for-profit research, development, and education organization, and it was established in order to develop and demonstrate innovative approaches to sustainability practices. The lab signature approach combines holistic system thinking, a pioneering theory of change, and a rigorous definition of sustainability, along with 5 core sustainability principles. The lab engages to develop portfolio of modern model projects that showcase the application of the sustainability principles. At the same time, the lab itself is being developed as a network of activity centers around the world that map onto particular ecozones, drylands, tropics, highlands, mountains, etc. And it is in this, and we hope with the time, of course, to cover all the different biomes of the planet. It is in this context that we established the collaboration with TIDIS and the University of La Palmas of the Gran Canaria in order to address issues over time of sustainability in island ecologies. And at the outset, and as a first collaborative effort, we defined tourism as a relevant sustainability-related issue of importance to address. The lab definition of sustainability is anchored in a concept of a particular kind of dynamic equilibrium in the interaction of a population and a carrying capacity of an environment, where carrying capacity is basically defined as the ability of an environment to support activities of a given population in general and in a particular level of quality. The model we are presenting today looks at this interplay between tourism and carrying capacity, a very important topic, I think, in the Canary Islands. And later in this presentation, I'll say some more about the significance of taking this particular approach. So, Carmelo, back to you.
Dr. Benelli. Next, Dr. Andrea Bassi is going to present the conceptual model to the audience. Please, Andrea.
The model, both the approach and the results. So I've prepared a short presentation to go through main slides and provide information on what we have developed. But I want to first provide a brief introduction to say that the project, as Michael mentioned, is really a collaborative project. And it is a project that was possible, implemented using a systemic approach, because of the collaboration of a number of different experts that have knowledge and experience working in different thematic areas. So what we have done is that we have worked together with a diverse project team, as Michael mentioned, to develop in two phases what we call the Carrying Capacity Canary Island Model, or CCCI. This is a system dynamics model used to analyze the interplay between tourism and the sustainability related impacts it has on the Canary Islands. And it was developed following a two-step approach. First, we analyzed qualitatively the main dynamics in the system, and then we went on to quantify those dynamics. Now, going into the methodology right away, I will focus first on the first step, so on the causal loop diagram or a map of the system. Now, this is a tool that is normally used to identify key variables and indicators in the system, and then to identify what are the interconnections that exist between these different variables and indicators. The main goal, once we have identified variables and interconnections, is to understand what are the main dynamics of change in the system. What makes so that we have the number of tourists increase in this specific context, and what makes so that we may see a deterioration in the quality of the environment. So it does show the relationships of cause and effect in the system. If you're able to identify these relationships and think in terms of cause and effect, then we are going to be better able to identify what are the intervention options that lead to positive outcomes in the system. So to briefly show you this process of developing the model, I want to go over a few steps in the creation of this model, the qualitative model. First, as Michael mentioned, we started from carrying capacity. We identified that this is affected or influenced by marine habitat quality, terrestrial habitat quality, urban environment, and the air environment, and atmospheric environment potentially. And so these are the key thematic areas we started exploring at first. And it already gives you an idea for why we had to have that multidisciplinary team working on the project. As a next step, we started looking at the fact that population goes on to affect carrying capacity, meaning that it has consequences on the different aspects of quality of these ecosystems that go on to affect carrying capacity in turn. So we do have circular relations that we call feedback loops that are important and should be considered in the analysis. So it's not linear, it's not a straightforward analysis, it actually embeds nonlinear dynamics and circular dynamics. What we then added to the diagram is the number of tourists, because we have locals living on the islands and then we have tourists that stay for short, medium, or long-term stays. And we divided tourism into two different broad categories: conventional tourism, creating even more of a challenge or stress to carrying capacity, but then also eco-friendly tourism that adopts sustainable tourism practices and potentially reduces the negative impact on the environment. These would be tourists that value and appreciate the quality of nature, and so they would tend to use a bicycle and walk instead of taking a car, for instance. Or would tend to prefer hotels that are built with sustainable materials, and so on and so forth. We then progressed in our analysis to consider that these different elements of carrying capacity will go on to affect the environmental quality. And the environmental quality of the islands goes on to affect the attractiveness for tourists of the islands. We will see later on that attractiveness is defined in the mathematical model in more detail, looking also at the type of activities that can be performed. But certainly there is a relationship between attractiveness and arrivals. So this starts showing that if there is a deterioration of the quality of the environment, then maybe the islands become less attractive. That leads to less tourists. And so there is a lower economic contribution of tourism to economic activity. But nevertheless, if you're going to see less tourists, then potentially we see less pressure on the environment. We did not stop here. We added a few more elements. For instance, we considered the fact that when the tourism sector expands, whether this is conventional tourism or eco-friendly tourism, there is going to be an increase in foreign investments. Now, this is going to potentially have impacts on the local economy, increasing the cost of living, and so pushing locals to move more to remote areas, or potentially bring in foreign companies that will build hotels and infrastructure and therefore reduce the potential for income creation for the locals. One of the consequences of these dynamics that has been explored in certain islands over time is the process of gentrification also, where we have the upgrade of infrastructure that results in higher cost of living for locals. And so this is in a way a side effect. Besides the environmental side, it's a side effect for social dynamics. We then considered the potential impact on employment and how this may affect immigration, meaning that some workers may come, build their hotels or the infrastructure, or come to work in the tourism sector and then potentially stay on the islands, and then goes on to add to the population that we see in the area. Now, overall, we see that tourism provides a contribution to GDP. This is what emerges here on the right side of the diagram. And both economic activity and the performance of the environment or environmental quality go on to affect our population welfare. Welfare in this case is a broad concept that takes into account both how the locals enjoy living in the Canary Islands, and that's why they value environmental quality, both air quality, marine habitat, terrestrial habitat, and so on and so forth, but also the possibility to have a job and earn income. And so it merges both aspects that are economic as well as social and environmental. And at this point, we started then asking ourselves what intervention options we can consider to shape, in a way, future trends, future scenarios for the tourism sector in the Canary Islands. And so we started looking at these orange variables that would be external intervention options for us to consider, such as, for instance, introducing noise-free zones, which improves the urban environment, or introducing eco-friendly hotels or providing an incentive for their expansion that would also have several positive impacts. At the same time, we consider protected marine areas targeting marine habitat quality and reforestation targeting primarily terrestrial habitat quality. Then we went ahead and considered wastewater treatment expansion, again, an indirect impact acting at the source to address marine habitat quality, and solid waste management, both the capacity to collect, to process, recycle, and reuse to go on and affect terrestrial habitat quality. So this starts highlighting that some of the intervention options are more reactive, meaning we want to fix the environment potentially without affecting the causes of change, the factors that make the environment deteriorate over time, while some other intervention options are more proactive, meaning that we want to address the causes of stress for the environment directly, such as waste generation, wastewater management and treatment, and so on and so forth. And so we ended then with public transport and non-motorized transport, renewable energy capacity expansion, energy efficiency, some of the other more traditional intervention options that do not only apply potentially to new infrastructure, let's say, for instance, eco-friendly hotels, but could also apply to the full stock of buildings that we have on the islands. And so expanding the reach of this intervention also beyond the tourism sector. Now, as you can see, and I know it may look like a messy set of variables and arrows, the model is fairly complicated, meaning that it includes a variety of variables that are all interconnected with one another, forming circular relations. And once we're able to understand what these relations are, we're able to plug in intervention options that would improve the forward-looking scenarios for the islands. Now, we did not stop at just looking at these indicators. We actually performed a full cost-benefit analysis resulting from the quantification of these indicators and more. There are several more in the mathematical model, and that will be part of the presentation as well, but coming towards the end. So just a little preview as to what the policy analysis looks like. Now, when it comes to developing the mathematical model, so we look at the second step of the process of developing this carrying capacity model for the Canary Islands, we followed best practice in the system dynamics field. This is a methodology that goes hand in hand with systems thinking, which is the methodology that normally is used to identify the indicators and their interrelations, like I've shown before. System dynamics offers the opportunity to quantify these relationships and then to run alternative scenarios into the future. Running the model to 2050 takes no more than 1 second, and so it makes it very easy to run what-if scenarios. Now, the process that we followed in this case is to identify the problem. In this case, it's the sustainability of the tourism volume, both tourism arrivals and activities on the islands, in addition to the presence, of course, of the population. Identify the causes and effects or dynamic hypothesis for this issue, which is reflected in the diagram I presented earlier, to then move ahead and add numbers and equations in the model to generate a baseline scenario. Once this baseline scenario is validated, both in terms of equations and numerical results, we then proceeded with policy analysis, looking at alternative scenarios. So a bit more information on the model. It is built using a software called Vensim. It actually runs on a free version of the software if you're interested in using the model further. It looks at time in a continuous way so that it doesn't optimize at a given point in time, but it offers continuous time simulation until 2050. And the modules and the variables are interconnected through feedback relationships in the same way as you have seen in the diagram I presented earlier. And also in the same way, it includes social, economic, and environmental indicators across a variety of sectors. As I indicated, it runs from the year 2000 to 2050. We chose 2000 so that we can validate the model against historical data for about 20 years. And then we let the model run until 2050.
Can you stop 1 minute?
Yes.
Okay, can you continue?
So, as I was indicating, providing some more information on the model runs from 2000 to 2050 to allow us to validate its results for at least 20 years until 2020 against data. And it runs what if scenarios to assess policy interventions. So, what if we introduce ecotourism? What if we introduce more renewable energy? This is basically how the model works. Now, as you can imagine, based on the causal diagram, the model includes a variety of components. Here you see we have climate assumptions on temperature and precipitation. We have population and tourism, which are measured as number of people, total number of tourists that would be on the islands. Land use is represented as agriculture, settlement land, for instance, measured in hectares. We do have a representation of fish stock as well, properly as a stock that includes the basically reproduction of fish and then fish catch and mortality. We have the stock of roads as public infrastructure, as a proxy for mobility, water demand and supply to look at the water use extent for different types of population values, including tourism, and then wastewater treatment, which goes on to affect water pollution, and solid waste generation as well as collection. We then capture energy demand overall divided by energy sources and power generation capacity also by technology so that we can differentiate between the use of renewable energy and thermal power generation. We then have a specific module on marine habitat, which as you can imagine is connected to the fish stock as well. And then we have the aggregate indicators that look at population welfare and carrying capacity that make use of most of the modules and indicators that I just mentioned now. Now, with this in mind, as you could expect, there are many scenarios and policy assumptions that we use in this model. I would just highlight what are the two main scenarios, and then I would refer to the full report that will be available very, very soon at the end of this presentation, so that you can then find more details on the characterization of the simulations. But to begin with, we have a business as usual scenario, which by definition represents a scenario in which there is no change in policies, no change in the ambition for sustainability. And so it assumes a continuation of the historical trends, meaning there is no constant future trend, but a continuation of the trend that we have seen historically to a large extent. Then we have the sustainable tourism scenario that assumes instead that several policies are introduced. And these are all the orange variables I presented earlier. And they're designed to support the reduction of the negative impact of population and tourism on carrying capacity, as well as the conservation of natural capital and the strengthening of ecosystem service provisioning, increasing carrying capacity. So we work in two ways in this case. We work at reducing the negative impact and then also on increasing the quality of the environment and therefore carrying capacity over time. Now I want to go over the results so that you get a sense of the type of analysis we were able to carry out. And I start with the number of tourists, one key variable, of course, in the model. Now you see in the graph on the right side, two different lines. They're overlapping up to 2023, and then we see a red line, the baseline scenario, declining over time, and the blue line, the sustainable tourism scenario, slowly increasing over time. Now, this is highlighting that with the baseline scenario, the impact on carrying capacity will be so strong and felt so much that potentially the attractiveness of the islands will decline, making so that there will be fewer tourists arriving in the islands. Now, this may be a strong scenario, and in fact, in the report, you will find alternative simulations that assume that there is a weaker relationship between carrying capacity and tourism arrivals. On the other hand, the dynamics of change that I'm going to describe in the next few slides remain the same. So we are focusing here in this case on the extreme scenarios to give you a sense of the full breadth of the results that we're able to generate. Now, in the sustainable tourism scenario, the blue line, we see instead that there is a continuous growth, even beyond the value that we currently see. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the tourism arrivals, we had a following the trend. We followed the trend fairly well. Then we had an increase towards 2015. Then we had a decline afterwards, and then COVID happened. Now there is a bit of an increase again. We are right in the middle. So basically, we follow the 10-year average with the blue line, and we follow the 5-year average with the red line. So we are right in the middle, the two trend lines that emerge from currently available data. Now, if you look at these two scenarios, the number of hotels as a second variable follow pretty much the trend we see for tourism or for tourism arrivals. This is what we see in the graph at the top. We have potentially a slight decline going forward in the BAU scenario, meaning underutilization, and so reduced profitability of tourism operations, while we see an increase in the number of hotels in the sustainable tourism scenario. The graph at the bottom shows that that increase is primarily due to the increase in the ecotourism hotels. And so this represents a way to rejuvenate, to stimulate further the tourism sector to allow for more growth. Now, no surprise in this case, employment at the top follows just about the same trend. And at the bottom, tourism real GDP is also very similar. We have to say that tourism real GDP is not only directly impacted by the number of tourists, but the quality of the environment affects the value addition and spending per tourist, meaning that the better is the environmental quality, the more tourists will be willing to pay to stay for a night or a week or more on the islands. And so there is a multiplier effect, a more than proportional effect, both on the decline as well as on the upside. Nevertheless, the difference is quite striking. If you see the values by 2050, just the tourism GDP goes from a little bit more than 2 billions to close to 4.3 billions in that one single year. Now, when it starts getting interesting, in my view, is when we look at the impacts of tourism activities. If we take waste, for instance, as an example, we see that in the sustainable scenario, the blue line again, the impact is smaller until about 2040. Despite having more hotels and despite having more tourists. The value becomes higher, but nevertheless stays stable in the longer term between 2040 and 2050, showing that even if you're further increasing the number of tourists towards 2050, there is no change in the wastewater that is being generated. And that is because of increased efficiencies and increased wastewater treatment that we see happening as part of the assumptions that we have simulated in the model. So here we see the starting of a decoupling between the number of tourists and the impacts they would have. Waste is one example. The urban environment here is a second example, with traffic congestion declining despite the increase of tourism activities, so number of tourists and the activities they would perform. The noise perception, one of the indicators considered, also declines and then levels off in the longer term, instead of reaching a peak like in the baseline scenario and then declining because of the reduction of tourism activities. So what we clearly don't want is to have an overshoot and then a decline, which is what the red line shows in this case. We would want to act swiftly, reduce the problem, and then find an equilibrium for the longer term. Similar dynamics are seen for energy demand, where we see at the top a decline in the total energy consumed in the range of 30% by 2050. Again, despite the increase in tourism values, population is about the same level for residents. And that is also achieved because of the increase in the share of electricity generated by small renewables, decentralized renewables in this case. Now, when we start bringing all these different factors together, we can start lining up the environmental impacts. And so here we see CO2 emissions from the energy sector, air pollution, PM2.5, all stabilizing over time. And we can start thinking about what is the net impact on carrying capacity. Now, marine habitat is one of the key factors that affects carrying capacity, and we see that it has been declining over time. And instead to continue declining following the business as usual scenario, it would level off and stay constant. Now, marine habitat is a stock, and so it gives us hints as to what will happen overall for the carrying capacity, which is also stock. Terrestrial habitat, if you look at forest land as a proxy, follows a similar trend. We had a decline, and we are able to avert that decline and reach a more stable trend going forward, despite the increase in human activity, despite the increase in population. Where we see a very interesting trend instead is population welfare. Now, this is again bringing together the GDP impact and the environmental impacts on carrying capacity. And here we see that there has been a small increase historically in total population welfare, not as high as the growth in GDP of the tourism sector because of the negative impact of the environmental consequences. But in the future, we see a bifurcation in this case. There is going to be a negative impact if we continue business as usual, again, because the tourism sector will not generate the value it used to generate, not per tourist, not per person, and not total. But in the other case, thanks to the improvement of the quality of the environment, we have an increase in welfare. And then thanks to an increase in the profitability of the sector, we also have an increase in population welfare. So we see in that case a win-win situation emerging over time. Now, carrying capacity overall does not show any shocking results. It is already quite an achievement to stabilize the past decline in carrying capacity and make so that it stays about constant all the way to 2050, or even slightly increasing, like we see in this specific graph. It will be very difficult to bring back carrying capacity to the value it had in the year 2000. That would require a massive investment and a series of interventions, potentially going back to close to having the level of tourism we had in the year 2000. It's just not practical and not even desirable. On the other hand, we see that we can avert that decline and stabilize that trend and make it slightly increase going forward. Now, I guess the question most of you would be asking is, but how much does it cost? Is it even worth it to do this? And so this is where, as I hinted at earlier, we have prepared a cost-benefit analysis, one that is integrated, meaning that it does not only capture the financial indicators of investment and revenues. It does cover also added benefits, for instance, the value of marine ecosystem services, and avoided cost, for instance, the cost of air pollution, cost of congestion, noise pollution, and social cost of carbon, that are normally intangible for an investor, but are nevertheless important for people, for society. So this is what the Green Climate Fund, for instance, calls an economic on top of financial analysis. It's a social cost-benefit analysis in practice. And we will see at the bottom here the benefit to cost ratio. So basically, an indicator that shows us if the benefits and the avoided costs are larger than the investment required. And if we use a discount rate of 3.5% every year until 2050, we see that for every euro invested, we end up generating 8.8 euros in return. So from that point of view, despite being longer term, it is very much worth it. Now here we can see the sum of the investments at the top: wastewater management, solid waste management, water desalination, power generation from renewable energy primarily, energy efficiency and reforestation costs, just to give you a sense of all the intervention options that we have considered. And then over here we see the added benefits and avoided costs. Again, tourism GDP is a big part of the benefits that are being generated, by far the largest among all the other benefits and avoided costs. Nevertheless, we see that there is income creation from employment that is also important, and we have a series of other avoided costs, as I mentioned earlier, that should be considered also. So concluding, reaching the end of my presentation, the results of the analysis show that there is a potential to create synergies, that decoupling I mentioned earlier, across the social, economic, and environmental outcomes for the Canary Islands when using sustainable tourism. Even when we work with this model, which is in a way preliminary, because it could be applied to specific islands, customized and analyzed in more detail for specific contexts, we hope that the model can inform a conversation, be a conversation started in a way for exploring the use of indicators that normally are not quantified, such as those externalities I mentioned earlier, and possibly promote more policy discussions, policy formulation and policy analysis with the use of a quantitative model, one that potentially, like ours, combines social, economic, environmental dynamics with different types of methods and tools that can be integrated. For doing that integration, we have used systems thinking, the approach that also Michael stressed at the beginning of this meeting. This is the underlying methodology that we have used to make so that we can bring together these different knowledge across scientific fields and also to inform different types of policymaking, because sustainable tourism is not only about tourism policy, it's also about infrastructure policy and environmental policy at the very least. Many more areas could be mentioned. And so we hope that with this type of analysis that is integrated and systemic, we can provide that starting point for a deeper conversation about tourism and the future of the islands in relation to how that synergy can be created across the two. With that, I thank you for your attention, and Carmelo, over to you. Thank you.
Andrea, now we are going to open a discussion and with the members of the team. And to open this discussion, we welcome a reflection from Professor Raúl Hernández, Chair of the Tourism Chair of Azotel of the University of La Laguna. Please, Raúl. What will be the necessary for the continuing of these issues? What is the implication of policy making in the future? And the potential involvement of society in this carrying capacity discussion?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. For the chair in tourism, it's a pleasure to support this event with the colleagues from TIDES. As the chair of tourism is committing this debate on measuring tourism sustainability for decision making. I think that there is a debate on how can we or must we manage tourism to avoid or even sometimes to extend the limits particularly in the context of an island region, bearing always in mind the carrying capacity approach. I agree with Andrea that the challenge faced by the Canary Island and the tourism sector are complex, are interconnected. Therefore, a systems approach to the topic is key, and I congratulate the research team for the results that we have been shown. I would like to highlight in the presentation the dynamic nature of the model, the possibility of having different scenarios. There is a model that is grounded to the territory, the holistic perspective, and taking into consideration the stakeholder perspective and highlighting which are the main issues. As the research that has been conducted is not only about sustainability of tourism strictly, it is about the way that tourism activity affects carrying capacity in the whole Canary Island. I must admit anyway that I normally avoid the concept of carrying capacity because of its biological origin, and that in societies there is a possibility of improving through management the carrying capacity, but this is exactly the approach that has been developed in this project. To end, in my opinion, the main contribution of the model is not only related to the accuracy of the prediction, but the contribution is to improve our understanding on the working of the Canary Islands and the role of tourism in the following years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raúl. Next, we would like to go back to Michael to ask him what is the significance of this exercise that we have conducted for the carrying capacity model in the Canary Islands.
Thank you, Carmelo. Let's look at it for a minute. On the face of it, questions about the desirability of developing the tourism sector as part of an economy looks like a no-brainer. Tourism brings income, creates jobs, enhances and accelerates development, and more. Looks like a silver bullet. In fact, since the mid-20th century, world tourism as a whole has exploded, reaching some 1.5 billion entries in the pre-pandemic level. And the Canary archipelago, with its rapid supercharged tourism activity, is a case in point. In the Canaries, you have seen an explosive growth from some 15,000 tourists in 1965 to well over 15 million in the pre-pandemic years. This with a local population of only 2.2 million and a diverse, rich, but very sensitive and fragile ecosystem. The obvious and immediate economic gains from tourism tend to dominate the prevailing perspective, and priority is put on ongoing expansion and growth. The promise of short-term gains tend to overlook the adverse impacts on the authentic culture, the local community, the local economy, long-term reserves of water and other resources, and the pristine ecosystem itself. Many of the items that have been discussed in the model itself. Economic development policy and specific developments in the tourism sectors are oftentimes driven by few dominant interests, thus shortchanging the true complexity of the question that should be considered, turning a blind eye to important externalities. This is why it is so important to bring a holistic approach that enriches the understanding of the interplay between the many myriad factors that are involved. Our model attempts to provide a first stab, a preliminary stab, at providing a basis for broadening the discussion in ways that can avoid critical pitfalls and ensure a sane tourism development to the advantage of all. Thank you, Carmel.
Thank you very much, Michael. Let's now go back to Raul, focusing on the practicalities of the Canaries. Can this approach deliver an improvement in the competitiveness of the destination of the Canary Islands?
Thank you, Carmelo. I'm convinced that the concept of competitiveness, whether we refer to tourism competitiveness of the overall competitiveness, is properly analyzed through this kind of holistic approach. And why? Because this approach gives very valuable insights on the background of or determinants of economic development beyond the main economic variables. Traditionally, economists have developed models with little consideration to social and environmental issues. As in specific contexts, these issues could be neglected without affecting too much to the accuracy of the results. However, nowadays, the competitiveness of a region or a sector is heavily dependent on natural resources and the social background. The traditional definition of sustainability refer mainly to comparative growth, while modern definitions of competitiveness include long-term perspective, include the well-being of stakeholders, include efficiency, include sustainability, conservation of social and natural capital, and this, for example, is the definition of tourism competitiveness of the OECD. So, to answer your question, this kind of approach is very important, not only from a social or environmental perspective, but also to the traditional economic aspect of competitiveness, as competitiveness is related to all the other issues that have been raised in the presentation before.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful insights, Raul. Next, let's go back to the research team, and I would like some comments from Natalia Nino Giraldo on how do you find this approach to tourism sustainability? Could it be valuable to other locations or to other destinations or countries?
Thank you, Carmelo, for the question. Well, let's first recall that the approach that we're using is a systemic approach that models the carrying capacity of the Canary Island, and the carrying capacity is modeled based on the impacts that both tourism and the population of the island are putting on the environment. So based on that and being close to the modeling process of this carrying capacity model, I consider that if we apply the concept of carrying capacity to analyze sustainable tourism in general, the approach is applicable to a variety of locations where tourism is being analyzed, so no matter the location. Whether we are assessing the impacts of tourism on a set of islands, as it is the case for the Canary Islands, or if we are assessing the impacts of tourism in a lake, for instance, or in a specific mountain area, tourism generates a burden in that particular ecosystem anyways, and also in the society that is living around the area. So the concept of carrying capacity is widely applicable for a range of locations as long as the impacts analyzed are aligned with the context of the problem and the specific location that we are analyzing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Uh, Now let's turn to uh, another quite specific issue regarding the Canary Islands. I would like to ask Vanessa Armendaris, also a researcher in the team. Vanessa, do we need to customize this approach to different islands, or this is a one fits all type of approach, taking into account that the Canary Islands are 8 different islands?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question related to the applicability and the insights we can get from this initiative and the current model. Let me start with saying that when we build a model, we need to define its purpose. And its purpose could be to explain very specifically a decision-making process in a specific island. However, in this case, this model had the purpose of reflecting the interplay between tourism and the carrying capacity of the whole region. So it could be an instrument to capture and show what are the structural dynamics and simulate those numbers, but thinking about the whole region. A next step that is possible using exactly the same model is to run specific numbers for each of the islands that we know in the Canary Islands are portraying a very different development model and pattern. The types of insights because of the feedback processes and effects of any living system, in this case the islands, if we run specific models, we may be able to inform in a very meaningful way the specific decision making that are more accurate to the state of development. We know, for instance, that not all the islands in Canary Island are expressing this mass tourism. So the use of this model with the specific numbers, running this model with the specific numbers of the island could be a very good tool for decision makers. And for instance, if we think about La Palma, there may be very important insights to inform the future development of each of the islands.
in terms of the difficulties that policymaking has every time in real life and all the uncertainties, how do you think is the value of this approach to deal with uncertainty?
The normal scientific approaches, which are non-systemic, are very limited to respond to the challenges we're facing currently, such as climate change and the feedback effects of the different decisions and structures that we built in the last century. So we really need to understand in a different way, and systemic approaches represent a qualitative advance in this type of understanding. Policies, they tend to be to be crafted in a very linear mind setting. So when we start using systemic approaches, we are able to go to the root causes and address structural issues of any society, of any economy, of any environment. And by addressing those structural issues, we are able to understand actually what are the leverage and what are the conditions we need to nurture and improve in order to have better systemic results, instead of thinking that perhaps implementing one action will have a very proportional effect on the environment or on the economy. So addressing systemically some decision making that are very critical in current times can actually help us build resilience in the system as a whole. In terms of carrying capacity, this is something that is very absent of the debate, even in sustainability issues. So addressing in a systemic way policymaking, especially dealing with environmental issues, could realize and could help us realize the many economic benefits that we can get, and societal benefits, by doing the right actions. And my recommendation for this will be to start promoting these systemic approaches, and not only promoting for understanding, but really, as Andrea said at the beginning, taking these examples and these cases as a conversation starter for with decision makers, with scholars, to really solve together and understand together what can we do in these very challenging times.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. We are reaching now the phase in which we are going to have an open discussion on questions from people from the audience in the chat. We have a couple of questions that are addressed to members of the research team. One of the questions is addressed to Andrea. Andrea, the audience asks, what if the model is actually designed for what type of environments, urban or rural environments, or protected ecosystems, if it is this consideration in the model?
Yes, thank you. It is a very good question, especially because no model can cover all these aspects well at the same time. So we have actually covered both rural and urban and critical ecosystems, because we have coupled the system dynamics model with a spatially explicit model that has generated maps that were able to estimate, for instance, habitat quality. And so we had a way of confirming and validating our results against these maps. But in general, I would say the model can be customized to the specific needs of the local context. And so if you were to look at another island, we may have many of the same indicators, but we may also introduce new indicators that are not there in the model right now. Or maybe we would analyze in a much more detail certain indicators that are more relevant to another island context. So in essence, my answer would be that we need to consider both, but at the same time that we may need to consider using different methods and models to do a proper estimation of the indicators that are relevant for one urban and the other rural context, and maybe adopt also different models to do an assessment of the critical ecosystems and ecosystem services at the local level. So there is knowledge integration in understanding how the system works with the system map, and there is also knowledge integration on the modeling side to figure out how to bring together different models in a coherent way. I hope these answers the questions. Over to you, Carmela.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We don't have many more questions from the audience. Actually, one of the comments that may be worthwhile to be discussed in this very first meeting on this road ahead to carrying capacity and sustainability in the Canary Islands is that to what extent this is a realistic model. There is a concern of the one comment here concerning with the realistic aspects of the model. It says that we receive more than 40 million tourists, as I said at the beginning, and there is 2 million residents. So there is some concern of these realistic aspects of the model. Who can address this topic? I think that all the team can work out. But if you, Andrea, could comment on this, please.
I can start providing an outsider point of view, and then, of course, others are very welcome to provide more of an insider local point of view. My first reaction is based on the conversations we had when we started creating the model. And these conversations pointed to the emergence of some discomfort, potentially, for the number of tourists that we have now in the islands. Again, of course, there are differences from island to island, but the noise, the pollution, the traffic congestion, these are all factors that reduce the welfare of the population. And so there were discussions as to whether this trend can and should continue, or whether the local population will demand that a change is implemented to focus more on high-value tourism as opposed to quantity of tourism. Now, we also see from other contexts that tourism follows very specific rules in a way. First of all, we need to look at competition, what other areas are available that offer similar type of service to the Canary Islands. We discussed that as well. But then also, we need to consider what is the key trademark of tourism in the area. We have seen other islands that lost more than 90% of their coral reefs, that lost the high value tourism and had to convert in a forced way to low value quantity tourism. And that has not necessarily generated the value that was expected. It called for massive infrastructure investments because you have more population coming to the islands, but the return on investment for that infrastructure was not as good or as high as expected. And so, see, there are different types of considerations to make. One is population welfare and well-being. The other one could be the financial sustainability from a public sector point of view of the oversized infrastructure investments that are being made for tourism, when maybe some or most of the revenue and value addition are being shipped over to other countries, maybe where the foreign investors are residing. So this is just to say that we should look at the signs based on causality and not wait for the evidence of a potential downturn to come up before this conversation actually starts. That being said, I would mention that the model can be used to simulate alternative scenarios. And thanks to Carmelo, for instance, we looked at scenarios in which there is less sensitivity of tourism arrival in relation to carrying capacity. And so that allows us to have still an impact on the environment, but at the same time, a growing number of tourists coming to the islands. Now, that may reduce the impact of environmental quality on arrivals, but it doesn't reduce the impact that tourists would have on energy use, on waste generation, wastewater generation, on the impacts on ecosystems. And so again, some of the signs are there, but they are not necessarily showing up as a crisis yet, but it's something to keep an eye on, I would say. Thank you, and over to you, Carmelo.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Let's turn to another concern that is opening up in the chat. It is about the application of the model to different contexts. the the listener is concerned about the area of Los Andes in South America, which is a ecotourism more prone destination. Can this model be also adjusted to those contexts, to those specific contexts, developing countries and developing regions and ecotourism? Michael, what would you say about this?
Well, I mean, I think as Vanessa argued very well earlier before, the model is a generic model. It identifies the generic variables in situations like this and the structure of their interactions. So with the adjustment for a particular place, it could be applied everywhere, whether it's developing or underdeveloped or whichever the situation. I think whenever you have a problem that relates to the particular issues that we've been investigating, this kind of model, again, conceptually and structurally, can be applied. I want to add one other comment about the questions of how realistic the findings are. And that's very important to understand that the model itself does not assess the possibility of implementing the right things. The model itself just provides a more or less, how shall I say, objective, I say objective with objective view of a situation. It doesn't guarantee that the right actions will be taken. And whether the conclusions are actually acted on in the appropriate way depends on many other factors, how strong existing entrenched interests, politically, economically, and otherwise are, how strong the community in the place is in demanding change, how far are the political system willing to go, and so forth. So the questions of the realistic thing is really independent of the model itself. The model doesn't guarantee, as I said earlier, its appropriate implementation.
Thank you very much, Michael. Another person from the audience also is concerned about the material. Is asking if the analysis is going to be reported. And as I said earlier, you are all going to have a link to the report, which is going to be sent to all of you, and where you can consult all the analysis that has been conducted for the case of the Canary Islands. And of course, as we have been discussing, it can be also an example to other destinations and other types of tourism and contexts. So I think we have reached the end of this event, and I would like to thank all the participants and the research team and the University of Las Palmas and of La Laguna for collaborating on this event, and FIDE Caja Canarias and the Ministry of Tourism of the Canary Islands government. Of course, all the stakeholders and researchers that have been contacted for producing these results. And I would like to give the final say to Dr. Michael Benelli on the final comments for this presentation. Please, Michael.
Well, I'll have to, of course, echo your thank you as the first step. So I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in this study. I want to thank Carmelo, of course. I want to thank Andrea, Vanessa, Natalie, Marco now, Matias Gonzalez, Juan, Jamie, Yen Lam, all the people that participated and all the experts that we discussed things with in constructing this model. At the same time, I think Carmelo mentioned earlier, I'd like to thank the Foundation for the Advancement of System-Oriented Management in St. Gallen for providing some of the funding for this project. And of course, I'd like to thank Carlos, who was not part of the study itself, but really helped us over time understand some of the issues that are involved, and for Raul for articulating those issues so well. And thank you, of course, for all the technical people behind the scene here who made this presentation today, supported that and made it possible. I'd like to just say a couple of words very quickly. It is clear from our time spent in the Canaries that the awareness is beginning to dawn everywhere, that the issue of tourism is becoming a major issue. There's concerns about the water reserves, there's concern about energy, there's concern about food, all of those kind of things. I'll also add at this time that from the viewpoint of the sustainability laboratory, the definition of sustainability itself is anchored in that concept of the interplay between a population and carrying capacity. I mentioned it earlier. I'm adding it again now for emphasis. It's that interaction and the equilibrium in that interaction that we need to seek if we are serious about establishing the concept of sustainability as an organizing concept on the planet, in La Palma, in the Canaries, and everywhere else. The La Palma Island itself is in a particular interesting situation in relation to the question of tourism. It's really at a crossroad. It's not yet so fully committed to mass tourism as you can see in other islands in their archipelago. So the hope that Andrea also articulated very well is that this first preliminary look at the questions will provide an opportunity to think or rethink and think the issue of tourism in a more profound way. And I hope that our work really convince everybody that you should be involved of the inherent complexity of the issue, and therefore that it will stimulate the kind of broad and deep discussion that the topic actually deserves. If you are to craft a sane policy moving forward, sane tourism development policy for moving forward. We, of course, at the Sustainability Laboratory will welcome the opportunity to continue and work with you on those issues. Thank you very much. And Carmelo, please have the last word.
No. Thank you very much, Michael. I subscribed all you have said. It's been a great pleasure to work with you and with the Sustainability Laboratory and your research team. And there are a lot of issues that are interesting for the development of the Canary Islands tourism. And this is one of the important topics now in the discussion. So this is going to be a great contribution for the debate. I'm sure that there will be more developments that will follow up to this research in the Canary Islands and around the world. Thank you very much for your contribution, your effort, your input, your inspiration for working on sustainability, on breakthrough ideas that are very useful for having a better planet and a sustainable planet in the future. Thank you very much.